So, welcome everyone, and thank you for coming to this History Indoors talk with Amy Saunders. Um, we are absolutely thrilled that you could join us, and we are really looking forward. I say the royal we, looking forward to Amy's talk. So, thank you to those of us who are deciding to spend your afternoon, evening, morning, depending on where in the world you are. Amy today is going to be talking to us about connecting queens in heritage sites, the three Elizabeths. It is my absolute pleasure to be hosting this talk with from Amy. She is a fifth-year PhD student at the University of Winchester under the supervision of Dr. Ellie Woodacre and Dr. Simon Sandel. Her research explores the reconstruction of Stuart kings and queens in heritage sites, with a focus on themes including othering, gender, sexuality, religion, conflict, and art. Amy has published multiple book reviews and an article on Christina of Sweden in the Royal Studies Journal. And she's recently appeared on the Tudors Dynasty podcast alongside me and Dr. Ellie Woodacre. Amy and I are also working towards a publication on queenship and cross-confessional identities that we can't wait to share with you all in the future. And in case you're wondering what Amy is going to be chatting to us about today, she's going to be looking at how these three really important queens named Elizabeth are connected and how they appear in the public imagination. Elizabeth I obviously looms quite large, and she's remembered as the Virgin Queen, and she's represented numerous times on screen. But we have this other royal woman who you can see on your screen, Elizabeth Stuart, named after Elizabeth I. And it's actually through Elizabeth Stuart. I'm not stealing Amy's thunder. This is in the abstract that she kindly gave to us. It is through Elizabeth Stuart that we get to the current British royal family. And so that's how we get to the third Elizabeth, Elizabeth II. And so Amy's going to look at the connections between these three royal women and is going to look at Elizabeth Stuart's representation in heritage sites. So without further ado, I will stop talking so that we can give this over to Amy. So thank you very much for having us, and I will pass it over to you.
Cool. Thank you very much, Jo. And thank you everyone for coming along this evening. So it's been a little while since I've done a History Indoors talk, and it's all changed since then. So I'm really excited to be here tonight to explore the connections between Elizabeth I, Elizabeth Stuart, and Elizabeth II in heritage sites, as we've heard from Jo. So if you enjoy my talk tonight and are interested in the 17th century, please do go over to History Indoors on YouTube, where I've done other talks such as Geoffrey Hudson, Disability on Display, and the life and legacy of Christina of Sweden. We will have a Q&A at the end, but I've also included my contact details on the screen in case you want to follow me on Twitter or get in touch with any further questions after today. So tonight, hopefully that worked. I think that worked. So tonight I'm going to discuss three royal women who all shared the name Elizabeth and explore how they are connected to one another in modern heritage sites. Before I get started, I want to say that there will be a brief mention of fertility struggles and miscarriages in this presentation that some viewers may find upsetting. I keep these very brief, but I just wanted to let you know before we get started. Throughout this talk, I will be discussing heritage interpretation, and before we get started, I also want to clarify what this means. I'll be talking about the reconstructions found in heritage sites, which include the panels and the labels that are found in these spaces and can be connected to specific objects. These are variably referred to as introduction panels, written interpretation, and labels. Interpretation in heritage sites also includes tours and talks and any type of interactive experience that you might have used, engaged with in the past in these spaces, such as trails and interactive screens and things like that, which don't feature in this talk but do form a really important part of my overall research. Whilst I'm sure lots of people here already know plenty about at least two of tonight's royal women, I'm going to begin with a brief overview of all of their lives and how they're connected so that we're all starting off at the same footing. These overviews are incredibly brief, but I will highlight some readings at the end of my talk in case you want to know more, especially kind of about the 17th century queens that we'll be discussing. So, Elizabeth Tudor, later Elizabeth I, was born in 1533, famously to Henry VIII and his second wife Anne Boleyn, and Elizabeth was born at Greenwich Palace and was named after her grandmother Elizabeth of York. Despite Henry's desperation for a son, Elizabeth replaced her elder sister Mary, who had been deemed illegitimate, as heir presumptive to the throne. And I'm just going to say here that Jo, who's hosting, has recently finished her PhD on Mary I and has given several fabulous history indoors talks on Mary, if you'd like to check those out on our YouTube channel as well. So after Anne's execution, Elizabeth too was deemed illegitimate, but nevertheless, both Mary and Elizabeth played significant roles in the baptism of their younger brother Edward and were later reinstated to the line of succession in 1544. All three children were highly educated, with Elizabeth learning Latin, Italian, French, and Greek. And as for Elizabeth's religion, this has received a huge amount of attention and debate from historians. In the words of Patrick Collinson, Elizabeth's parentage determined that she should be, if not some kind of Protestant, no kind of Catholic. And furthermore, as her very existence rested on Henry and England's break from Rome, her later reign was not acknowledged by many parts of Catholic Europe. What's important for this talk is not where Elizabeth positioned herself on the religious spectrum, but how she has since been transformed in memory, the historical narrative, and popular culture. In these spaces, everything exists in binaries, including Protestant versus Catholic, and thus Elizabeth has come to symbolise early modern Protestant womanhood. If you'd like to know more about this, I highly recommend looking out for talks and future publications by Myra Katatanis, who is currently looking into this in more depth. Elizabeth's own reign is popularly remembered in terms of the question of her marriage and her position as the Virgin Queen, her dealings with Mary Queen of Scots and the latter's eventual execution, and the Spanish Armada. Immortalised through paintings, Elizabeth has since been the subject of numerous historical fiction books, films, and television series, where she's been portrayed by some very renowned actors, including Helen Mirren. Now, Elizabeth Stuart was the daughter of James VI of Scotland, later James VI and I of Scotland, England, Ireland, and Wales, and his wife Anna of Denmark. And she was named after her father's cousin, Elizabeth I. James deeply believed that it was his destiny to inherit England, Ireland, and Wales from Elizabeth I, and aimed to flatter the Queen by naming his daughter after her and asking her to be godmother. This reflects the concern of his own mother, Mary Queen of Scots, who asked Elizabeth I's approval for her son's name and also asked her to be a godmother to James. James and his daughter therefore share their godmother, and both drew on this connection to legitimise themselves during their own lifetimes. Elizabeth Stuart was born in Falkland Palace in Scotland in 1592 and was James and Anna's eldest child. Anna went on to become pregnant and give birth many more times, but only Elizabeth, Henry, and Charles survived beyond infancy. When James did inherit the thrones from Elizabeth I in 1603, he travelled south to London, and later Elizabeth Stuart accompanied her mother in June and also moved down to England. Like her godmother, Elizabeth received an education in languages, including French and Italian, as well as riding, music, and dancing. Unlike her father, Elizabeth's childhood was fairly peaceful, with the exception of the gunpowder plot, where the conspirators aimed to kidnap her and place her on the throne if their plan had succeeded and James had died. In 1608, Elizabeth moved to court, where she participated in a range of court festivals, including court masques, and formed a very close bond with her brother Henry, who had become Prince of Wales. Elizabeth Stuart had many suitors and married Frederick V, Count Palatinate of the Rhine, an elector of the Holy Roman Empire in 1613. Elizabeth and Frederick left England at the end of April 1613 and travelled to Heidelberg. Although their marriage was a happy one, the political situation was tense, and became even more so when Frederick accepted the crown of Bohemia. Thus, in 1619, Elizabeth became Queen of Bohemia, which is one of her names that she's kind of more commonly known by. The couple were not popular, however, with Elizabeth and Frederick both offending the feelings of their new nobility and citizens. Spanish troops then invaded the Lower Palatinate in 1620, and in October the Catholic armies advanced on Prague. Frederick's troops suffered a terrible defeat, and the royal family fled in 1621. Elizabeth is often referred to as the Winter Queen, a nickname derived from libels and satires that labelled her husband the Winter King due to their short reign in Bohemia. In her recent biography of Elizabeth, Nadine Ackerman highlights that many of her contemporaries instead styled Elizabeth the Queen of Hearts and referred to her as the best of queens. The final Elizabeth dealt with in this presentation likely needs the least introduction. Elizabeth was born in 1926 and died last year in September, surpassing Victoria as the longest reigning monarch in British history in 2015. Elizabeth was born to Prince Albert and Elizabeth Bowes-Lyon, and her father was the younger son of George V, meaning that she was unlikely to ever ascend to the throne. However, when her uncle abdicated in 1936 and her father became George VI, Elizabeth became heir presumptive. Like the other two Elizabeths, she received an education in language and music and in history. Elizabeth married Philip Mountbatten in 1947, and Philip was given the title of Duke of Edinburgh by his future father-in-law the night before the wedding. They had their first child, Charles, now Charles III, in 1948, and in 1952, when George VI died, Elizabeth ascended to the throne as Elizabeth II. As we have all lived through at least part of the reign of Elizabeth II, and likely have different opinions about her actions and activities, I'm going to leave this here. But what is important for this presentation is how Elizabeth II was head of the Church of England, and that she fulfilled the traditional role assigned to Queen Regnants and consorts alike of having multiple children to continue the royal dynasty. So now I've given an introduction to each Elizabeth that we're going to look at this evening. I just wanted to quickly show you a family tree in case any of their family connections are still a bit unclear. And I apologise if this is a bit small, depending on what screen size you're watching. It's just because there are so many people and this isn't even everybody. So here we have Elizabeth, daughter of Henry and Anne. And over here we have James VI and First marrying Anna of Denmark. And underneath them we have Elizabeth Stuart. Now Elizabeth's daughter Sophia married Ernest Elector of Hanover, and it was their son who later became George I. Now, Elizabeth II is not shown here, but George I was her 5th times great-grandfather, and it's through Elizabeth, therefore, that the monarchy passed on to the Hanoverians and eventually to the Windsors, and through Elizabeth Stuart that Elizabeth II and now Charles III can trace their family back to the Tudor and Stuart dynasties. And this connection is utilised within heritage sites, as we're going to see in the examples this evening. So hopefully that all makes sense and is a little bit clearer, but I can answer any questions at the end if not. So now we're going to talk about Elizabeth's representation in heritage sites and explore how these reconstructions connect her to both the Tudor past and the present-day British monarchy. First up, we have Montague House in Somerset, which is now owned by the National Trust. It's a really wonderful place to visit, and if you like early modern portraits, I would highly recommend you go, as the long gallery upstairs, which is the kind of bottom photo on the screen, houses a selection of portraits on long-term loan from the National Portrait Gallery in London. From March 2018 to November 2019, a special exhibition in this area focused on Elizabeth Stuart. The decision to create this temporary space dedicated to Elizabeth was inspired by an important early 17th century bed associated with her marriage in Montague House, which includes the arms of James VI and First and Frederick V, Elizabeth's husband. So the exhibition included paintings and prints related to Elizabeth and her family, and we're going to look at some of the interpretation texts found in this space in more detail now. So the image on the screen shows the introductory panel to the exhibition, and you can see here that Elizabeth is given her highest title as Queen of Bohemia. If you take a closer look, you'll see at the text, you'll see that it situates Elizabeth within her royal family connections, including her father James, her godmother Elizabeth I, and her relation to George I. Whilst it does not mention George's connection to the modern monarchy here, this can nevertheless be seen as an attempt to bring Elizabeth's narrative further forward into the present. Something that you may have already noticed is who is missing. Only James is mentioned as her parent here, and her mother Anna is not included. Now, this is reflected across many of the heritage sites I've explored for my PhD research, which highlight royal children's relationships with their fathers, but do not give queen consorts the same attention. Further on, we can see that the interpretation deals with the question of religion. Elizabeth and Frederick are identified as a Protestant couple, and those who attack and lead the couple's exile leads to the couple's exile are Catholics. This places religious conflict at the heart of the couple's reconstructed narrative, but does not extensively examine the cause of these problems. Whilst all interpretation has a limited word count, the wording here can be seen to lessen Elizabeth and Frederick's responsibility and avoids discussing their direct reactions to the war. Elizabeth's position as a Protestant royal woman can be seen as incredibly important to the retrospective act of building a cohesive chronological royal and Protestant narrative. The Act of Union in 1707 led to the creation of the United Kingdom of Great Britain and also decreed that no British monarch could be Catholic or marry a Catholic. This latter point was changed in 2013. As several of the Stuart Queen consorts, including Henrietta Maria, wife of Charles I, Catherine of Braganza, wife of Charles II, and Mary of Modena, second wife to James VII and II, were Catholic, it would be hard to reconcile the modern monarchy's confessional identity with these past Stuart royal women. Perhaps luckily for the 18th to 20th century monarchy, due to the succession of the Hanoverians, these Catholic queen consorts are not the direct line through which today's royal family are connected to their Tudor and Stuart pasts. Here then, Elizabeth Stuart offers a convenient and importantly Protestant royal woman through which to trace their legitimacy. Just after discussing the couple's rule in Bohemia, the interpretation goes on to discuss Elizabeth's later life, highlighting that she campaigned for the restitution of the Palatinate, first for her husband and then for her children. This focus on her children and her activities, which sought to provide them with positions and power, highlights her position as a mother and her attempts to support her children. The label text accompanying this painting in the exhibition also emphasised Elizabeth Stuart's connections to both her father and her godmother. The portrait is describing is also on the screen and shows Elizabeth wearing a thick rope of pearls, which may have previously belonged to Elizabeth I and were gifted to James by James to his daughter. Furthermore, it describes her religion as militant Protestantism and highlights that Elizabeth herself was conscious of the connection between Elizabeth I and played on the association with her namesake. Later on, the text discusses the letters Elizabeth Stuart left behind, many of which were written in code. If anyone's interested, these letters have recently been translated and transcribed by Nadine Ackerman, who's also written a biography, Elizabeth Stuart, Queen of Hearts, which is based on these letters and challenges much of the historiography around Elizabeth that came before. So I highly recommend, if anyone's interested, that you go have a look at that. Elizabeth Stuart was also present in the National Maritime Museum's exhibition Tudors to Windsor's British Royal Portraits, which ran from May to October 2021. Here she was recognised as the daughter of both James and Anna, but Elizabeth I is still present. Elizabeth I's presence in this example is really interesting, as unlike the previous portrait, there is no direct visual connection between this painting and the Tudor Queen. Interestingly, in this exhibition, it started with Henry VII and Elizabeth of York and ran right through to present day. This means that the exhibition started before the union of the Scottish and English crowns and covered James's 1603 accession in its Stuart section. The use of British, therefore, in the title is anachronistic, and it can be argued that it aims to tie the Tudor and Stuarts together in a way that presents a sense of unity to a modern viewer that was not actually present during the 16th and 17th centuries. Interestingly, in Tudors to Windsor's, when George I was introduced, it was as the great-grandson of James I, and in the label text on the screen, Elizabeth's marriage is mentioned, but not her children. In this example, then, despite Elizabeth and Anna's presence in this particular piece of interpretation, both royal women were absent from later narratives discussed within the space. The final exhibition really highlights the connection between Elizabeth Stuart and Elizabeth II. For last year's Jubilee, the National Gallery created a virtual exhibition, Fit for a Queen, which is still available and you can still go explore. And this brought together 28 portraits from the National Gallery's collection that, quote, shed light on the notion of queenship with images that relate to some of the attributes most frequently associated with female monarchs, including Elizabeth II. The subtitles within the exhibition include Anointing with Holy Oil, Power and Leadership, Wisdom, Justice and Mercy, Service and Compassion, Royal Women of Europe in the National Gallery, and pictures loaned or given to the National Gallery by the British Queens. As you can see, some of these titles are clearly directly connected to perceived attributes, whereas others are connected to the National Gallery itself. These attributes were expressed through a variety of artworks, including religious images of women, quote, receiving acknowledgement of their special status in the hierarchy of the court of heaven, which the interpretation connected to Elizabeth II's coronation. There were numerous images depicting the Virgin Mary, including the coronation of the Virgin and several Virgin and Childs. In this way, although motherhood was not present in the introductory panels as an attribute for a queen, it was nevertheless present throughout the whole exhibition. The presence of motherhood and hereditary monarchy was particularly present in the section Royal Women of Europe in the National Gallery, which contained various portraits, including this one of Elizabeth Stuart. Once again, the interpretation only places Elizabeth Stuart amongst her male family members, only recognising James as her father and then connecting her to Charles and to Frederick V. In this case, both Anna and Elizabeth are absent, but so are Elizabeth Stuart's children, and with the focus being on her grief for her husband and her loyalty to England. The interpretation ends with the quote, "The sitter is an ancestor of Her Majesty the Queen. Elizabeth II was descended from the royal house of Stuart on both sides of her family." End quote. Despite Elizabeth Stuart's children and George I not being mentioned here, her importance to the current royal family is nevertheless reinforced through this conclusion, and Elizabeth II's legitimacy is enhanced through this 400-year-old connection. With the theme of the exhibition in mind, the attributes assigned to Elizabeth Stuart in this interpretation are doubtless those that the creators wanted to suggest were also present in the personality and activities of the late Elizabeth II, including a dignified character and loyalty to her family and to England. The text even connects the two royal women through animals, stating that Elizabeth Stuart's fidelity to her husband is symbolised by the little dog, presumably a favoured pet, who jumps up at her side. As Elizabeth II was famously attached to her pet corgis, this inclusion could be seen to connect the two further in the minds of the visitor, and perhaps create a sense of connection between the visitor and their own pets and these royal women. As with Tudors and Windsors, it's interesting here to consider the use of James I rather than James VI and first, as well as the use of British in Tudors to Windsors and England in the label text seen on the screen. Both of these approaches, whether intentionally or not, could be seen to exclude or minimise Scotland's position. Interestingly, Elizabeth's prominence as a Protestant early modern royal woman whose children connect her to the modern British monarchy can also be seen to create an in-group of idealised royal women, with others, some of the Stuart consort queens, placing them outside of this ideal due to their own confessional identity and fertility. Henrietta Maria, seen here on the left, was Elizabeth Stuart's sister-in-law and was married to Charles I. Despite having multiple children, including the future Charles II and James VII and II, Henrietta Maria was not present in the portrait collection of the Long Gallery at Montague House. She was also not physically present within Fit for a Queen, though a portrait that belonged to her and highlighted the themes of motherhood through the biblical story of the finding of Moses was displayed. The interpretation accompanying this image focused on Charles I's role in the commission of this painting that is believed to have been made in celebration of the birth of their son and heir, Charles II. Nothing outside of her connection to her husband and male child is discussed in relation to Henrietta Maria in this space. Similarly, Catherine of Braganza, wife of Charles II, can be seen to be othered within heritage sites due to her Catholic identity and fertility. Although Catherine became pregnant several times, none of these pregnancies were carried to full term, and the royal couple left no legitimate heir. In heritage sites and historiography, Catherine is often blamed for this and overshadowed by other royal women and Charles's mistresses who did have children. So what does this all mean? I would argue that Elizabeth Stuart's position in heritage sites is tied to the later importance placed on Protestant identity of the United British Monarchy after 1707. In this way, retrospect can be seen to play a big role in the reconstruction of Elizabeth, especially as her contemporaries, up until the mid-1640s and then again after the restoration of the monarchy in 1660, would have actually seen Charles I and Henrietta Maria as the couple who created long-term security for the Stuart dynasty. The retrospective knowledge of what came next in terms of Stuart and later Hanoverian successions places Elizabeth in an important position as a conduit between the Stuart and Hanoverians, which in turn directly links her to the current monarchy. Her position as a Protestant royal woman is really important in this context, especially when considering that the British monarch is head of the Church of England and until recently still couldn't marry a Catholic. This can be seen to create an in-group in heritage and historiography of idealised Protestant English or British queens. This is doubly interesting as it can be seen to forge a sense of unity. As it can either be seen to forge a sense of unity through the term British, or suggest English superiority by erasing Elizabeth's Scottish birth and identity. Whilst one of the examples seen here connected to the modern monarchy, whilst one of the examples seen here connect the modern monarchy to James rather than to Elizabeth Stuart, this was still done using James I rather than James VI and first, which can be seen to further present an Anglo-centric view of early modern England and Scotland and removes his Scottish reign and Elizabeth's Scottish identity. All the examples discussed here highlight the importance of dynastic connections, both to the early modern royal women themselves and to the modern British monarchy. These dynastic connections do not need to be direct, e.g. parent-child. For example, Elizabeth I was drawn on by Elizabeth Stuart and by James within their own lifetimes and was mentioned in both Tudors to Windsors and Montacute House in this regard. Nevertheless, Protestant royal motherhood can be seen to be reconstructed as the ideal, with Elizabeth's children being celebrated within some of the label text seen here. As discussed on the previous slides, this creation of an idealised Protestant mother others the Stuart Catholic queen consorts due to their confessional identities and their experiences of fertility. None of this is, of course, to say that Elizabeth Stuart does not need to be reconstructed within these spaces. As seen by the work of Ackerman, there is still much more to Elizabeth's narrative that could be reconstructed or examined differently within heritage sites in light of more recent research. What this talk has hoped to highlight is the importance of the continuation of the British monarchy in relation to how the English and Scottish royal past is reconstructed, and how this can place those who do not fit into a Protestant ideal outside of the royal narrative presented. So thanks so much for coming. I think that was a bit shorter than I planned, but that's okay. And thank you for listening to me this evening. If you'd like to read further, I have included a few kind of suggested readings on the screen. So there's both of Ackerman's books, and then Gemma Field's Anna of Denmark discusses her relationships with her children very well. And then the David Bergeron one does a really good discussion of Elizabeth Stuart's journey to Heidelberg and looks at that in quite a lot of detail. And yeah, you can still explore Fit for a Queen on the internet as well. So if you have any questions, please pop them in, and I think Jo will field them for us. Yeah, thank you very much.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Amy, for such an interesting talk. Perfect. There you go. I was about to say, I don't think we have the books on the slide. Now we do. Wonderful. Thank you all so much for your rapt attention. Obviously, we, as the behind the scenes, can see the numbers as they go up and down. And yours, I think, get the prize of being the most steady through the entire talk. So you take that as a win. It's very exciting. People seem to be very interested. So thank you everyone for listening. Thank you, Amy, for a fantastic talk. We have some questions already that are going into the chat. So I will put those on the screen so that everyone else can see those as well. But please do remember that you can always put your comment or question into the chat, and I will put them up on the screen so that Amy can see them and answer them, and so that our other live stream followers can also see them.
Shall I stop sharing my screen, Jo, so that it...
You can keep sharing, you can stop sharing, whatever.
I didn't, again, not having used this platform before, I wasn't sure whether to share it was a problem.
That's okay. Let's leave it up for a second. I guess while you answer this question, so that if people are frantically writing down contact info, they have it. And then we can take it off after this question. That should give people enough time. So the question that we have from Jem is, do you think that Elizabeth Stuart helped change the social consensus towards the views of women for her time? Or was this just the royal narrative? And then follow-up question, does she link to these ideas of early modern witchcraft in any way? Being a Stuart, and we know how James the Sixth and First loves his witches. So you can handle that in however many parts you would like to handle that.
Cool. I was expecting something on this from Jem, so thank you, Jem. So in terms of the witchcraft, she was very young, when kind of all of that was happening, and James's witchcraft activities do change kind of as he becomes King of England. as well as Scotland. So I don't know specifically what her views were kind of in the area of witchcraft, but I would definitely check out Nadine Ackerman, because if anyone has written about it, it will be her. And in terms of kind of the social consensus, that's again a massive question. And she's, like all the women discussed in this presentation, and the women that kind of Joe and I focus on collectively, she's in the very privileged position of being a royal princess and then kind of marrying and then becoming a queen herself. So there's, I think we'd probably say it's more the royal narrative. She's in this massively privileged position. She's get like all the education that she gets and things obviously are related to her position. And yeah, the thing with her is she's having all of her drama going on, and kind of not long after we then get the civil wars, and so there is quite a lot of discussion about her and kind of versus Henrietta Maria in the kind of public kind of view, because she's this, you know, Protestant woman who's lost her crown, and they've got this Catholic woman at home as their queen consort. So there's quite a lot of discussion around that. So yeah, lots to look into, and I can definitely send you plenty of book suggestions if you'd like to look into it further.
Isn't that always how it goes? We have way more questions than we have answers, and
Yeah.
that is what keeps research going. We I guess also had a question, a follow-up from Jem as well. I will just get it up onto the screen. What about the legacy for the country? And no problem, Jem, at all. Amy
We
and
don't want you
I
to pick up Jem ever.
love answering questions about our queens. Um, and so what is Elizabeth's legacy for the countries as they are now together officially?
Yeah, so it's really interesting. So the examples that I've kind of seen very much create her into this like English princess, because as I said, like you know, she's quite young when she gets here, so does spend kind of those quite a decent amount of years in an English court, in a kind of English setting, before going off and getting married and going to Heidelberg and then ending up in The Hague and all the rest of it. So she basically, when we see her reconstructed, she's very much reconstructed as like, oh, here's an English princess. And it's partially because of that connection that she creates between her and Elizabeth I. But it's also that there was, when James came down to England to become King of England as well, he gets criticised for how he speaks. He gets criticised for being Scottish, essentially. So we sort of see her being reconstructed as this sort of Englishness that I would say is there to mitigate James's position as a Scot. Like, James might be the King of England, but he's still a bit of a foreigner. So she can be reconstructed as this the Stuart English princess, and the kind of emphasis is very much on her being like English, which obviously she's not, but because she's growing up in that context, and can be seen as kind of more English than her father in terms of her experiences as a young child, she gets reconstructed in that way. So yeah, I would very much say that that's kind of what we see when she is reconstructed. I'm not saying she's reconstructed hundreds of times. Like, you know, we talked about how many times you see Elizabeth I, and to be fair now, Elizabeth II in popular culture, and you do not see Elizabeth Stuart in the same way. But you equally don't see the Catholic queens of this period in those places either. And if you do, they are never presented in a nice light. So when Elizabeth Stuart is presented, she's presented as kind of very positively and very English. And in comparison to the Stuart queens, she can definitely be seen to overshadow them in terms of, here's a successful Protestant mother Here are like, our awkward Catholic queens that we don't really want to talk about. So she's not represented hundreds of times, but certainly there is this connection being forged between her and the continuation of the monarchy, and kind of legitimizing all of that. So, yeah.
Wonderful.
Hopefully that answers your
Thank you.
question, Jeff.
It ties in actually to a question that I was wondering. And so as people kind of put thoughts together, and again, put any questions that you have into the live chat box there. A question building from this idea of Scotland and England being different countries, but how Elizabeth Stuart is represented very much as this English princess. I think you touched on this a little bit, but does her representation change depending on whether she's represented in Scotland or in England, or do we not have enough data to make that comparison?
I wouldn't say we have that data for her, but we definitely have that data for James and for her brother Henry, who becomes Prince of Wales. So very much in any Scottish heritage site that you go to, James will be either referred to James the Sixth because it will be dealing with pre-1603, or if it's dealing with post-1603, it will usually call him James the Sixth and First. Whereas, as we saw in kind of the Tudors to Windsors and the other examples here, he will be referred to mostly, not all the time. It makes me happy when he's not, but mostly in English examples will be referred to James as James the First, which just completely erases, like, he properly reigned Scotland for a decent amount of time as an adult, and it completely erases kind of that experience, and attempts to like bring everything in line from an Anglo-centric narrative perspective, rather than kind of dealing with it kind of in a more nuanced way. And similarly for Henry, because when Henry is born, this idea that James has that he's definitely going to become King of England on Elizabeth's death, basically means that from the day dot, he's like, right, we're going to make sure Henry is kind of celebrated in a particular way. And then obviously he calls him Henry. I mean, going back to the naming conventions. And what happens? So you do see Henry spoken about in Scottish heritage sites, and you do see him spoken about in heritage sites here, which is really interesting because then he dies like at 18 and doesn't become king. So there's a lot about Henry because there's a lot of sources and material for him. And again, was seen as this kind of great Protestant prince, and with the power of retrospect that we have for what came afterwards, he can be upheld as someone that Charles I didn't reach this marker that Henry would have obviously reached. But because he already had, they all lived separately to their parents anyway in their childhood, but in one of the, I think it's the Burrell collection, it's the Burrell collection in Glasgow, they actually have items on display that are from Henry's like Scottish household, so that's sort of like dealt with in that space. So yeah, the biggest difference you see is definitely between the discussion of James in Scotland and England, and sort of depending on how old the representation is, if it's permanent or temporary, the kind of difference between Mary Queen of Scots is two quite different conversations across the border, but you don't see it as much with the children, I think, because of that time that they spend in England.
Yeah, absolutely. And with that comparison between kind of Elizabeth and James and how they're represented, sorry, this Elizabeth Stuart, are represented in England and in Scotland, and that similarity and differences that they have. How does that compare between Elizabeth Stuart and someone like Mary Queen of Scots, who is a massive part of both national narratives, despite her only being queen of one of them? So how does
Yeah,
how does
so
Elizabeth fit into that?
the Mary Queen of Scots stuff is really interesting. So if anyone goes to the National Museum of Scotland, they have a massive collection that looks at Mary Queen of Scots and lent a lot of things to the Elizabeth and Mary exhibition that was at the British Library recently. And they very much approach her as a Renaissance queen, very much look at kind of her like art patronage, look at her, you know, kind of all of her different involvement in things, not just looking at kind of the conflict situation. The bit with Mary Queen of Scots that we tend to just seem to forget about, and this seems to go for kind of both sides of of it, is that we talk about her execution and we talk about her pre-leaving Scotland, and then there is this big chunk in between that just kind of gets referred to occasionally when it's like, oh, when there was plotting going on, but the context around that and where she was isn't really covered. So the only place it is, and Joe knows exactly what I'm going to say here, the only place it is that I've seen it kind of covered kind of extensively is at Sheffield Manor Lodge. So for anyone who doesn't know, I live literally just down the road from Sheffield. And one of the places where Mary Queen of Scots was imprisoned was Sheffield Castle, which no longer exists, and another kind of noble house, which is now Sheffield Manor Lodge. And that still exists, and they still do kind of costumed interpretation, and there's kind of discussions about like the letters that she was writing there. And that was one of the things that was briefly in the British Library exhibition. There were a couple of letters, but the only way you knew they were written from Sheffield is that it said at the bottom, like, you know, written from Sheffield, blah blah blah. And that's really interesting, and that I'd love to just look into that some more. So yeah, in Scotland, you definitely get the kind of here she is as a Renaissance queen, and then the kind of like, oh, then she was executed, and we miss out this big chunk in the middle. And like we do refer to it, we do discuss it kind of in historiography and stuff, but I feel like the most times you see that is when you're watching like a film about Elizabeth and there's some kind of discussion about the plots that are going on. That's the time that you see that, but you don't see any of like Mary's daily life in that situation or where she was or anything like that. So yeah, that's a really different one, and she's obviously given a lot more focus in Scotland than she is here. And I have friends who grew up in Scotland as little kids, and their kind of main memory of history at primary school is we were taught about Mary Queen of Scots, and that is like the thing that they are like that has stuck in their head. So clearly it's done in kind of a passionate and engaging way.
Yeah. And as Jem has just pointed out in the chat as well, I'll put that up for anyone interested. And then we have a fun fact as well, that Mary Queen of Scots, Mary the First, there are many Marys who should be mentioned more that aren't. And then some Elizabeths who should be mentioned more, and some maybe less. But that there really is this kind of post the historical event, post the historical people, this kind of rewriting and re-narrating of history. And so much of that is caused by location, and kind of not to open the can of worms. But it really does show it really does show, I think, the difference between Scotland's history and its perception of its own history, and then England's history and its perception of history. And in that, I mean the south of England, because obviously Sheffield Manor Lodge is going to have a different interpretation of Mary Queen of Scots' significance in England than London might. I think that's interesting that we often think in terms of when is this historian writing, what is the date, but less of where physically are they located and how would that affect how we look at sources.
Yeah, and just to like go off Jem's comment, Joe and I talk all the time about how one day we're just going to write a book about all the Marys who get ignored, because pretty much the answer is usually, well, they're Catholic, and the kind of post 17th century Protestant narrative means that, you know, they get a raw deal kind of regardless of what their contemporaries were actually writing about them. So yeah, like we are fully on board for that one. But yeah, I think geographical location is really, really interesting. And I know, obviously, Joe, you're coming to this having moved over from Canada, and obviously, I have kind of lived in different parts of the country. And it's really interesting to kind of look at the presentation of these narratives in Edinburgh and in London as seats of royal power, and as places that have continued to be capitals. So have continued to receive the funding, have continued to, you know, they can restore the Tower of London, they can restore like Holyrood Palace, they can, you know, all those sorts of things. Whereas there's other really significant sites that, because they don't exist in what is the kind of modern centre of power, have not received the same kind of care and attention. And that's really one of the things I think, in terms of the Sheffield example, that really affects the presentation of Mary, Queen of Scots, when you look at her and you don't see kind of this area mentioned. Because, as I say, the main castle doesn't exist anymore. There's no wonderful medieval walls. And if you said to most people, I live near Sheffield, their historical lens is not one of the early modern or medieval periods. It is a industrial kind of.
We're going to think of the 1980s
Yeah,
or 70s. We're going to look at those Thatcher years as opposed to everything else that has made Sheffield
yeah,
Sheffield.
yeah. And like the building I work in used to be located somewhere else, and so it's called Castle House and used to be built on the castle. And there's a lot of discussion at the moment about, should we be like uncovering the castle and having a look? And there's been a bit of archaeology over the last couple of years and things. And it's that sort of, it's not in people's public imagination to see that as somewhere with a castle and with, you know, city gates and all the rest of it. And that can affect, in comparison to thinking, oh, Edinburgh, the Royal Mile, Edinburgh Castle, like all those buildings still exist, they're all functioning. That's very different, and can really affect kind of that reconstruction of the narrative.
Yeah, absolutely. It's amazing, I think, how much the narration can be affected, and how these different geographical, historiographical, so understanding how the history is written, how much this affects how we see it now. Um, I also promised that we would have, I'm just going to switch so hopefully people can see both of us. I think that's lots of time for them to have written down your contact info. You can always come back to the video once we are off live, or you can pull it back right now if you do not yet have Amy's contact info written down. I promised a fun fact, and I will now reveal. Anyone who has been watching along in the live chat already knows the fun. But I don't think Amy does. So I I don't know if this is for Elizabeth the First or Elizabeth Stuart, but equally cool either way. And I like that the Stuart name has come through, Paul here. I don't know if it's the same Stuarts, but I love that Stuart name is still there. Um,
Yeah, as I'd say, I've just seen Stuart Paul say that he's the sixth cousin 10 times removed to Elizabeth.
yes.
So I'm assuming maybe Stuart Elizabeth. That is very cool. It's really interesting because actually I've recently started doing the family tree, and one of the things you realise is that every generation you go up, obviously you double the amount of grandparents you have, and you look at that number when you get to 10, and you think, this is crazy, this is absolutely mad. And so it's both very exciting when we find out these things, and also a bit like, oh yeah, that makes sense. Like, but basically, Paul, that sounds like you could claim the throne, so just go for it.
For the record, History Endures does not
Yeah.
endorse revolution. He has also just confirmed, Paula said it is Elizabeth Stuart.
Wonderful.
So we are absolutely loving that the Stuart name is still in there.
Yeah,
Um,
and spelt the
I
Scottish
feel
way
like,
as well. I mean, that is great.
yeah, I feel like that's one. where if you know you have a famous grandparent, you're going to make sure that name sticks in there. Um, yeah, that's fantastic. As anyone looking to get questions in, please do remember that you can post in the messages in the live chat. Um, I have one more because I am very privileged to know kind of how Elizabeth Stuart fits into the rest of your thesis, which for the number of women you cover, she's not one of the main ones. So I'm wondering, you focus on the first three Stuart kings, regnant, queens, consort. Um, yes, yes. I was like,
Yes.
have I got enough? Yes,
Yeah.
three. Um, and obviously, Elizabeth is not a queen regnant of England or Scotland, and she is not a queen consort of England or Scotland. And so, I guess how do the themes that we see with Elizabeth fit into some of those wider themes? How does she compare to the other women that you're looking at for the thesis?
Yeah, so as I sort of kind of alluded to, I think in reply to one of Jem's questions, I'm not saying she's presented a million times, just that when she is presented, she's presented kind of more favourably than we see with the Stuart Queen's consort. And one of the really big things is definitely this kind of understanding of motherhood, which I just really think needs to be changed. Nearly probably 90% of the examples I've looked at, I'm not happy with how it's discussed. As I said, like you always get like, oh, Elizabeth Stuart, like the daughter of James. It's like there's another person there, you know, the person who actually did the like 9 months hard work, and that's all very much kind of connected to our kind of societal kind of issue. We're talking about anything that's deemed like unclean, in inverted commas, and so Elizabeth Stuart gets to kind of be in that privileged position that she has loads of children, and that leads to the modern monarchy. So she fits in kind of the thesis overall, in that she is kind of that link to the present that the others aren't, and that kind of affects how they are presented in heritage. So they're really the other three consort queens are really affected by their confessional identity, their foreign identity, and then Catherine is particularly affected by her fertility when we look at kind of these reconstructions and heritage sites. And Elizabeth doesn't have any of those problems, and so that's kind of where she fits in, and why she has a little chapter in my thesis, to basically talk about how the quote unquote successful Protestant royal women can overshadow these women who are kind of deemed as being other in some way. And you get it as well with Charles II's mistresses. So variably, some of them are Catholic, some of them are Protestant, some of them change. But they overshadow Catherine as well, and other Catherine through their ability to have children. So the fact that they have children with Charles II really sort of places a lot of the blame on Catherine in historiography and in kind of the heritage sites reconstructions. It's always written like, oh, poor Catherine, like this never happened. And it always forgets that she did go through those pregnancies. And again, because of this, well, we can't possibly discuss that. Whereas actually, that is something that connects so many of these royal women, because they didn't, I mean, Elizabeth did, but a lot of these women did not straight away get pregnant, did not carry all of their pregnancies to full term. All their children did not survive beyond infancy. And instead of making Catherine Braganza this sort of fertility outlier of, oh, she failed again in inverted commas, instead we could use that to be like, let's look at women's experiences as a whole, and then let's also look at women's experiences who were non-royal women in this period, and then let's use it to talk about how today this is still a massive thing. This is still a massive thing that women struggle to talk about, struggle going through, and actually if we're going to talk about connecting the past and the present together and looking for kind of themes that engage people and make people like invoke a sense of emotion from people in a heritage site, why aren't we dealing with women's not royal and non-royal history in that way? So yeah, I feel like that is one of the things that if I come out of my pieces with anything, that is the rant that you know, as I say, like Elizabeth does get a better deal than the other Stuart Queen consorts in heritage in the examples that we've seen and things, but that actually they're all getting a pretty rubbish deal and none of their mums are ever mentioned. And yeah, it, you know, there's a lot of erasure of female narratives going on. Whether or not that's intentional, obviously, not pointing fingers and blaming anyone, but yeah, it's there. So
Yeah, absolutely. And even if it wasn't intentional, it's that kind of, well, we've pointed it out now. Here's how we can be working to
yeah,
move this, I guess, in a progressive way. Um, and and I think kind of as you've said, and as Jem points out in the live chat, is this idea that there are eminent historians who not recently, but very much based their analyses of queens, regnant and consort, based their reigns on basically, did you have children or not? Because if you didn't, what was your point? And kind of the recent historians who have gone, well, actually, royal wives, daughters, mothers can be incredibly powerful without having children. They can be incredibly powerful just by virtue of their position. And I think that's something that probably often gets overlooked for a lot of these royal women in this broader heritage aspect. That actually this is very nuanced and Amy, as you've said before, when you have however many characters to put on an interpretation text, how are you going to fit all of that?
yeah, that is definitely one of the big challenges. Is like if there are only 60 words, how do we deal with this? But I think some of it's also about the objects that we pick. You know, there's a painting of Catherine of Braganza that comes up all the time, and it shows her with all these images of fertility around her, which obviously at the time, sorry, got so passionate there, I threw off my glasses. That obviously at the time, she, you know, she was really hopeful that she would produce an heir to the throne. So that's, you know, why she's presented with all this kind of these lambs and these cherubs and things. But it now means that every time they use that painting, it ends up being a focus on her fertility instead of being, have we looked at her patronage? Have we looked at this? Have we looked at that? And a very kind of new thing that I feel like is going to be really exciting in kind of the next 10, 15 years in terms of kind of royal studies is looking at quasi family relationships. So we look a lot when we're talking about kind of, you know, non-royal relationships about kind of bigger family units and all mixed family units, all those sorts of things. But we never talk about that in relation to kind of royal families. And certainly James, we can see James practicing parenthood on some of his younger relations prior to becoming king and having his own children. Well, sorry, not prior to becoming king, but prior to his marriage and prior to having children with Anna. And we can also see Catherine, despite not having children of her own, taking Charles II's illegitimate children and forming relationships with them that can very much be seen as a type of motherhood, as an expression of maternity. And so to say, oh, she had no children is a lie kind of in both the, well, she went through this and experienced a lot of illnesses related to it, but also that she did in some way express ideas of motherhood to other people. So I think that'll be really exciting. Hopefully, in like 10, 15 years' time, our bookshelves will be littered with that and everybody will be really excited. But yeah, so yeah, it's definitely a hard job putting these narratives into heritage. And I think a lot of the time, get very focused on, we really want to show this painting because this painting's really famous and this will draw people in. But it's not necessarily the painting or the only painting or kind of object that we could be using to tell a more kind of diverse story.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's one of those kind of outside of the interpretation text, it's this kind of need for curators to go like, here's the info I want to share, but then meeting the public and going, okay, where is the history versus what the public will pay or will want to come and see? And I think that's again can be so difficult. And I have never tried to do that. So I can only imagine kind of those hard discussions in boardrooms trying to come to decisions about, what are we going to get object wise? How are we going to present this? That it's complex but important, I think.
I think it's quite interesting because you get some of the bigger, kind of more traditional institutions have more access to a variety of objects because they can pretty much ask. There's always things you can't ask for, but they can pretty much ask for quite a lot of things from different collections over the world, but are potentially less likely to seek like a community engagement in the process. And this is one of the things I was really upset that the James the Sixth and First exhibition that was supposed to be held by the National Portrait Gallery of Scotland didn't go ahead because I know that they held working groups with people who are at the forefront of like scholarship on James, on Anna, and that they kind of dealt with a lot of the big questions, and really discussed them and kind of made sure that in terms of like sexuality and gender and parenthood and stuff, that those things were going to be approached in a different way than we've seen before. And then COVID happened and it didn't happen. But that's what we need. We need working groups. We need collaboration. We need community involvement. And it will make it a better place. It will make it a better exhibition.
Yes. Absolutely. I think that is a very positive note to end on. I also want to share Paul is very lucky and is heading, and I'm going to claim non-British citizenship here. So please don't at us if I've mangled this. He is going to Dunfermline, apologies, in Scotland. um, again, not British. I'm so sorry. And I'm very jealous that he is getting to travel. I mean, I'm currently doing historical traveling and I'm still jealous.
I was running around early modern Scotland in my mind this time last year. So I did Stirling Castle. I did the Borough collection. I did, where else did I go? I went to Edinburgh. Yes, I'm all here for that, Paul. Go have fun.
We love historical holidays. I think we can speak for all of History Indoors with that. History Indoors can endorse historical holidays.
Not revolutions, historical holidays.
So thank you to everyone who has watched this video, either live or for our future viewers who have just finished watching this back. Thank you so much for watching, for listening, for engaging. And as always, I will quickly put up Amy's contact information again so that you have it. This is your final chance to scribble that down or pause this. And thank you especially to Amy for sharing part of your research with us. It's always wonderful to get to hear what is up with these Stuart queens, especially in heritage. So thank you.
Thank you, Joe. Thank you, everybody. Have a good evening.
Wonderful. So we will sign off for tonight, this afternoon, whatever time zone you are in. And we'll say, please remember, I'll make sure I get the banner going here, to please subscribe, like this video, and visit our website at historyindoors.co.uk to sign up for upcoming talks. We do have quite a few exciting ones coming up. We have another installment in our code breaking and warfare series. We are going to have depictions again of RAF Bomber Command in film, TV, and radio. So some good wartime ones if that is your interest. We also have some pre-World War British Army a British Army talk coming up from a special guest speaker. And then looking forward into June, we have a talk about St. Edmund. So there is lots that is coming up, lots of interest to hopefully lots of people. So we will say good night, good afternoon, wherever you are, and thank you so much for joining us.